Okay, I beg your pardon. Now, can you hear me? Uh, can you hear me now? Okay. Hopefully, garbage in, garbage out. It's early on a Sunday morning. um, so, first thing we're going to be talking about is this uh, comparison between Freud and Jung. And thereafter, I will go into the essay of Erich Neumann about Sigmund Freud. So let's begin with this. Good. So, in terms of the conscious mind, Freud thought that the conscious mind actively suppresses our desires and our unconscious. The Jung believed that the conscious mind constructively negotiates with our emotions and constructively negotiates what we're doing. This is why creativity is so important, because we are able to use our logic, our conscious mind, in what, our ego, in order to determine what to do with the emotions that are coming up from the psyche. And we have messages coming from the deep unconscious all the time, and we have to decide what to do with them. And so Freud, on the unconscious mind, Freud believed that it was driven by sex, our libido, and aggression. And Jung believed it was influenced by our lived experiences. Well, that's certainly true in my own experience. So it's not only about sex and aggression, because if you're not that sexy, but like me, and you're not very aggressive like me, I only bring out my weapons to be aggressive occasionally, not always. Okay, next one, a dream analysis. Freud says that dreams are a manifestation of a human's innermost desires, and Jung says dreams can reflect on many different aspects of one's life. And I would say that the same is true. The same is true of all things that come from the unconscious. They're basically messages from the unconscious. They come to you in dreams and visions. And visions, they can come to you in hairs on the back of your head or your neck, or whatever way that your psyche decides to get through to your conscious mind. Okay, so the next one is transference. Freud believed that it required a hierarchical relationship, and of course, the poster boy for that right now is Dr. Jordan Peterson. And Jung said it requires leveled mutual relationship. So, for example, we can transfer certain feelings about people in many ways. An example would be when I lost my mother. My mother-in-law started to live with us in my neighborhood. She literally lives in the apartment next door. And I found that my behavior toward her was becoming more than just strictly polite, but was really becoming a relationship like mother and son. And so that would be a kind of transference. And what happens in analysis when you have a relationship with an analyst. An analyst can sort of become like a father or a mother, among other things. And so, one finds that if one loses one relationship with a partner, with a life's partner, the love instinct will transfer to someone else. I think that's sort of the best way to kind of understand it. So David Salomon says libido ended being defined as psychic energy. Yeah, it's now psychic energy we're talking about. And there's a great book called Psychic Energy by Esther Harding. I urge everyone to get a copy of that and read it. So next is the understanding of science. And Freud said psychology is an empirical science. And Jung said psychology is a science that can be used to support religious, spiritual, and cultural ideas. And but he still felt it was a science. And he regarded himself as an empiricist because he was having people come into his clinic and he was experiencing what they had experienced, that those would be data points. It's sort of the difference between logos and eros. Freud would believe that he had to make everything rational, and Jung understood that some things happen irrationally. And he says right in the very first 2 paragraphs of the Red Book that he had to leave behind all of his his book learning and his science, all of his knowledge, and find out what was really going on. And so in terms of understanding of religion versus spirituality, according to this table, Freud said religion, spirituality could be separated from psychology and research. And Jung said religion, spirituality is an essential part of developing the human psyche. And as I learned over decades of studying Jung, Dr. Jung's work is very largely about religion and talking about historically what happened in religion and how people of a certain age interacted with religion and that sort of thing. In fact, I have a book here. I don't know if you can see it, probably not, but it's called The God Image from Antiquity to Jung by Lionel Corbett. I haven't read this book yet, but he's talking about the relationship or the way we see God over millennia, really. And finally, practicing psychotherapy. Freud believed in frequently seeing his patients. He would have 6 sessions a week. Jung saw his patients twice a week. And, sometimes he had patients that he didn't see for years. And sorry, Jordan, I see you're waiting here. I was showing this chart that compared Jung and Freud. Let's see, I'm trying to get you in as a panelist. It doesn't seem to be working. Okay, he's not ready to be admitted as a panelist. So anyway, that's about all I wanted to say about those that chart, unless Jordan wanted to comment on it. And David says, religion teaches us moral values, and these moral values can be a part of the self-concept. Yes, I agree entirely. But just teaching us and hearing, let's say, our fathers say, "Thou shalt not kill," or what have you, isn't that effective because it comes from the logos side, from the rational side. And sure, the Ten Commandments give us very rational things that we should do, but unfortunately, a lot of us don't do those things. And so there's a comment right at the end of Answer to Job here in paragraph 758, which I will read because it relates to the Apostle Paul. Let's see. It is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul. This is the very last 10 lines of Answer to Job, where Jung says, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and his split consciousness. On one side, he felt he was the apostle directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is and is never more than his own limited ego before the one who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. And so what Jung is saying, Freud's saying, very logically, thou shalt not kill. Well, okay, what if you have an enemy army that's killing all your neighbors? Are you going to not kill in that circumstance? Unfortunately, we have both sides, and we have to find a way to live between the opposites. We have to live in the gray zone. And so one of Dr. Jung's favorite biblical verses is 1 John 4:1, which I'll put on the YouTube chat here, which is examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not, because you might get a sorry, let me see if I can get Jordan in here. You might get an idea that's not a very good idea, or a satanic idea. And then you need to have a strong enough ego to decide not to do the wrong thing. Jordan, you arrived.
There we are. It is quite a technical Sunday morning.
Sorry about that.
Now I pulled out the big guns to move the file to read from over onto the big gun computer.
Okay. So, Jordan, I got ahead of you since I didn't have you to comment, and I went all the way through this chart. Did you see the chart I sent you?
I did. I was. I'm between 3 devices now, so now I'm only on 2, and it all works. But the one thing I wanted to comment on, I did see the chart, and I'm going
to bring it back up so you can make your comments. Go for it.
Yeah, especially the first one that really resonated with me was when you mentioned the unconscious mind and Freud driven by sex, our libido and aggression, whereas Jung says influenced by our lived experiences. And as you mentioned aptly, you bring your aggression out, your libido out on occasion, but it's not there all the time. And I think that's really important because I remember a grandmaster in Taekwondo once saying, never show your teeth unless you're going to bite. There were no threats. There were no wastes of energy that way. And I always felt that stuck with me as one of the most important lessons in life, to be able to be calm under fire, under anything really, and also to be able to focus, because then, as Jung said, the conscious mind constructively negotiates our emotions.
Right.
And from that, to me, there's no reason for your emotions to dictate how you feel.
Right.
And what happens then is you'll to run. It's natural. You don't stuff it. You don't displace it. And you actually don't transfer it to your anxiety internally or onto another person. You simply experience it. Right. And I think that then going through the rest of the chart, dreams can reflect on many different aspects of one's life. Whereas Freud said dreams are a manifestation of humans' innermost desires. Freud seemed to be hung up on morals and sex. And I find that to be a shortcoming of Freud as a person, because I don't feel he ever had the child become the parent of the man, the child become the parent of the adult. Whereas Jung was, well, I am me, I am thou, as Martin Buber might say, to drive through their conflict, because they were saying almost the same thing. And then on transference, Jung saying it requires a leveled mutual relationship, whereas Freud says hierarchical relationship. Well, the problem is here's a reversal. Freud's saying requires a hierarchical relationship with yourself. And the thing is, Jung is saying requires a leveled mutual relationship. That's with self and other, both. So again, Freud is inherently out of context. It's always about somebody else. And in reality, it's about his shortcoming of sticking with this sex and libido thing. And so, frankly, I find Freud to be rather prudish and Jung to be living his life. And I'll stop there to have your comment. You had already gone through them as well. So I just really find that this chart is a wonderful contradistinguishing, the contrast of distinction, where you literally contradistinguish. It's me, it's you, it's I and thou, it's both of us as I and thou and me and you at the same time. But then Freud believed in frequently seeing his patients. He would have 6 sessions a week. The thing is,
I'm sorry.
That's like a modern.
I'm sorry, Facebook. You had attenuated. You said 6 sessions a week, and then what?
Freud believed in 6 sessions a week. That's like a Facebook newsfeed overburdening trauma. You're always in the affect, and that's affecting your capabilities. Whereas Jung spaces between to live these things into their lives and actually be present. Whereas it seems like Freud is often only keeping someone in trauma about their trauma instead of allowing them to have resolution. So I'll stop there.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of these things are covered in the experience of someone who joins the Marine Corps, whether you join for OCS or for basic training, because there are things going on that one normally doesn't expect. And I give an example of the fact that I think most people who think of Marine Corps basic training is very rough and ready all the time, and they're screaming at you and all this stuff. And that's a stereotype that is out there in the world. And I think a lot of young men and women who join the Marines think that's the way it's going to be in their initial training. And, you know, indeed, the first, let's say 4 hours of it is exactly like that. People are screaming at you and telling you, you know, if you're in basic training as opposed to OCS, they're actually footprints painted on the parking lot, and you have to go and get your feet on these yellow painted footprints, and they are indeed screaming at you. But that is really only the first 4 hours. Okay, and then what do they have to do? They have to be like your parents. And by that, I mean both your mother and your father. So the drill instructor becomes both your mother and your father very quickly. First, they get your attention because what you're training for, if you join the U.S. Marines, is you're training for war. And you have to be aware of that. And we here at the Naval Academy, they're doing the same thing. And so every plebe, every freshman at the Naval Academy has to jog in the dormitory. The dormitory actually has 11 connected buildings. And so it's one building, and all 4,000 midshipmen live in that building. But the freshmen, and usually there's about 1,200 of them to begin with, for the entire first year, have to literally run. They call it chop. It's a kind of jogging down the center of the corridor. And every time they come to a turn, they have to shout, "Go Navy" or "Beat Army" or something like that. And so if you have 1,200 people doing that in all waking hours, except after taps and before reveille, it's bedlam in there. And the point is that it's a screening method to see if you can operate under, very loud environment. And so there is a certain element of that in basic Marine Corps training. But what happens is that they teach you basically to march in that first 4 hours. And then they have to take you into the squad bay, which is the barracks. And they have to teach you how to make your bed.
And drop a coin that it bounces. Right. It's
right. And so that's something your mother would normally do, right? And so here's this tough as nails sergeant who has seen it all, has been deployed at least once, and he has to stop and maybe not perfectly gently, but at least he has to, in a normal voice, explain to you how to do the tucks and so on, so that your bed is made properly for the Marine Corps, and that's a feminine function, a mother function, and so this sergeant who's becomes your parents is both mother and father, and there is that kind of transference onto him. And I just thought in terms of this chart, which I'll put up on the screen again, it really is, you have to, the mind constructively negotiates our emotions. So sure, it's natural for someone who's just joining the Marine Corps to be a little bit anxious, let's say, about what's going to happen in the next 8 weeks of training or 10 weeks of training in the case of OCS. And so, what I found is once I realized that they couldn't touch you, they couldn't beat you up like an abusive father might do. They couldn't be an abusive father because the law doesn't permit them to do that. That would be assault and battery. Once you know that, then you, the individual, you allow your mind to constructively negotiate how your emotions are. And so when you get into the squad bay and he's teaching you how to make your bed, you can go, oh, this isn't so bad. And then
I'd like to
go ahead.
I would say I'd like to. I think that's a wonderful way to express to me the psychology of, say, what the Marines or any of the armed forces are doing.
Sure.
Is they are forcing the rite of passage to occur, and at the age 17 to 21 is proper and natural. But what's interesting to me is the drill sergeant first forcing the parents out of you, the masculine, feminine, the Venus, the Mars. And here's the thing. I take the parent piece a little bit bigger, and instead of masculine, feminine, I say capital M, mentor, capital T, tormentor, one hyphenated word at the same time. And what happens then is when they pull the parents out of you, you stop reacting.
Yep.
You realize you can't be hit. You can't be hurt. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words, will never hurt me. That comes into play. And it's not so cliche then, because you start to realize it doesn't matter the whisper or the volume. It could go to 11. You're still, what have you. There's this deafening sound of silence. And then you start to learn that no news, silence can be good news, not I'm about to be in trouble. It's you then being able to then take the parents that have been transferred, the literal transference, the drill sergeant has imbued transference out of you, of the parents, to pull them into your perspective.
Yeah. And
then what happens is then you realize you can't be hurt. You realize it's still always your choice to live or die, to take it, jump out to the extreme. And in that, then you become, or begin to become, the child who births the parent of the adult. And then you are your own mentor, tormentor. And then if something, goes all snafu, situation normal, etc., it's you, not who's going to save me. It's not, I'm not grounded anymore, or I am. It's, are my feet on the ground?
Yeah.
You start to self-regulate your psychology, I think, at that point. And I think that ability to be, grace under fire, if you can be the eye in your own storm, and then realize, oh, the storm is where all the treasure is. Let me go back into that storm. Right. And then you're always that. You don't have to have this big, calm boundary around you of peace and quiet. The peace and quiet is actually not so restful at that point. You start to learn that that's when you've taken a wrong move. I mean, it's like with kids. Oh, it's too quiet. Something wrong must be happening.
Okay, so enough of the chart. Let's talk about David Solomon here says that I heard that Freud plagiarized some concepts from Arthur Schopenhauer. I think that is his name, maybe. And what I would say is, we all plagiarize from our predecessors. And if you want to see an enactment of that, see the movie When Nietzsche Wept. Okay, When Nietzsche Wept. Because in that movie, Freud is presented as the young man who's being taught by an older doctor about sort of about psychotherapy. And that was certainly going on for a long time, and it came out in William James and many others over at least the whole of the 19th century. And even William Blake was making etchings about it near his death in 1825. So
almost a full 100 years prior. And I would mention that in regards to saying plagiarism like it's a bad thing. That's a modern concept. That's literally a modernistic concept of you are all alone. It should be only your ideas. The reality is, like T.S. Eliot said, I laughed that he stole this from me 100 years before I was born. Good poets borrow and great poets steal. And what that means is that Marine basic training is stealing. What happens is you make it your own.
Well, that's right. And if you literally are built, the motto is the Marine Corps builds men and women. Marine Corps builds men. Well, they're literally building you into being an independent Marine who can perform.
Right? And I think the most important piece of that is it's not that they're breaking you down. They're taking off your form work. They're taking off the supporting sculptural armature, that which supports you, so that you can begin to learn to support yourself. And the thing that's most important there is literally the forgetting is forgetting. Because when that's stripped, you are no longer what you were before.
Right.
And it's important that some of that quote unquote plagiarism of your previous experiences remains intact, because that gives you a basis. But at the same time, your expectations need to be inspected, because there are going to be new things that weren't there before, and they're going to require the same self-support, but especially when you have no idea how to do it. And so I think it was Teddy Roosevelt, when you have a great opportunity, always say yes, especially when you don't know how, and then go out and figure out how to do it.
Right.
So there's the real-time piece.
Okay, so now let's move to Neumann, but I just want to comment on one thing that's on the YouTube chat. Catherine, what you say is likely true, but we don't have to vilify people on this channel. And YouTube moderated your comment. I allowed it, but let's just be respectful here to the extent we can, because
that there's dignity and difference. We need to make sure that if a comment comes through, even if it's petty and small, that person can still grow. And so there is a reception of that. And at the same time, no blaming, because blaming still means you're playing one of your parents outside of yourself instead of utilizing it inside yourself. And to me, the old adage is complain all you want, but always bring a suggested solution.
Right. And all you have to do is look at Carl Jung's eulogy of Freud to understand that Dr. Jung was always respectful of Dr. Freud. Okay. The supposed battle between the two of them was an intellectual, let's say it was a debate in a way, but it was not disrespectful. And
there was also
so,
parent-child. Jung was
right,
more the parent and Freud was still the child, but at the same time, Jung did not, insult him.
right. And so now we're referring to Dr. Neumann's book, The Creative Man. And Dr. Neumann was known as sort of the best student of Carl Jung. And last week we talked about his essay about Jung himself. This essay today is a couple pages longer, so I want to sort of speed through it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the sort of the first 2 pages first, and then I'll stop. And
You're on page 232?
Yes. Okay, so this is an essay by Erich Neumann, and it's Freud and the Father Image. To write a eulogy of Freud to mark the centenary of his birth would be a totally superfluous undertaking, since both the acknowledgement accorded to his work and the effect it has had on the whole of Western civilization are unparalleled. Seldom have the obstacles that are of necessity placed in the way of a pathfinder been so quickly and completely overcome as in this case. Freud has become the classic representative of depth psychology barely 50 years from the time when he himself was quite unheard of and when hardly anyone knew the meaning of the word psychoanalysis. The outstanding success of Freud's work, which has transformed modern man's conception of life, is as much the result of the absolutely unique and original quality of his basic discoveries and of the brilliance of his prose as of the fact that from him to a new science was born. Keeping in mind that Freud was born in 1857, Jung was born in 1875, so he was a generation older than Jung. Before Freud's time, psychology had found expression in the works of the great poets, but scientifically speaking, had remained a mere stepchild of philosophy. With Freud, it burst into the consciousness of his time and was revealed as the fundamental science of the nature of man. We have before us, without always being aware of it, a remarkable phenomenon. Not only has everything previously called psychology been completely changed by the stepchild of philosophy, which is not a true science even today, and by that he means that philosophy is not a true science, not that psychology is. So a stepchild of philosophy, which is not a true science even today, but further our entire knowledge of the nature of human health and sickness has been shaken and transformed by the assault of depth psychology on our conception of the world. Not only psychiatry and medicine, but philosophy, the history of art, and that of literature, not only criminology, but ethnology and sociology, have all been profoundly influenced by depth psychology, not to mention religion. Our knowledge, not only of the illnesses of mankind, but also of those of the child and of primitive man, of the artist and of the criminal, has changed so fundamentally within the last 50 years that the ordinary person's approach to human nature, both the good and the evil sides of it, simply cannot be compared with the attitudes toward, the insights into, or the valuations of human nature held in the Victorian age in which Freud was brought up. Okay, I'll stop there. Any comments on that so far?
Yeah, very much so. And I think I'll tie them also to the concept of, did Freud plagiarize Schopenhauer? Because this is all about the experience, whether it's of the age or of the lineage. And what's interesting to me, both Freud and Jung, quote unquote, plagiarized Schopenhauer, except the thing is, Schopenhauer really brought up the first notion of individuation, except Freud took it down the path of individualism, selfish, self-centered, it's all on you, in you, a problem. Whereas Jung, basically, who let the dogs out, took it at individuation and let it run free in life. But I'd also then bring up Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who coined the esemplastic imagination, which is the wholeness, the integration, the experiential modification through life. And even more currently towards Freud and Jung, I would bring up William James, where there was kind of integration implied. He was trying to get at this natural quality, and that was then again experiential. And so Freud allegedly was more scientific on the statements, but Jung was scientific on the fly. He would have his science on a road trip. That tree's cool, turn left. And then he would mark it and he would revisit it. But I think this whole, within the last 50 years, that the ordinary person's approach to human nature, that piece right there, in 50 years, of a molecular speck of time, both Freud and Jung became the spearhead and the handle of
so we have
piece.
So we have Samantha here. Samantha,
oh, right on. Good to
hi,
have her.
Samantha, and love and light to you too, Samantha. Nice to see you. And David Sullivan says Freud and Jung talked once for 18 hours. Well, I think it was more like 13 hours, but nonetheless, it was a long time. And there's a terrific depiction of that in the movie A Dangerous Method. And if you haven't seen that movie, I've seen it enough so that I've memorized various scenes of it. More than 10 times, I suppose. But in that movie, this long conversation was the first conversation, physical conversation that Freud and Jung had. And it was the result of Jung sending his book called Dementia Praecox, which is about schizophrenia. Now called schizophrenia, and in those days it was called dementia praecox. He had sent that to Freud, and Freud had invited him to Vienna. So he went to Freud's house with his wife, and he and Freud got talking, and they just didn't stop. And Patrick, you have to see that movie to understand anything about this. And all of that movie, by the way, all of the events of that movie took place before Jung did any of his unique writing, really. They all happened before 1913, when the two of them broke up, mainly because Freud got fussed.
Jung was dialing in, and Freud was trying to explain. And trying to explain is a childish motion, rather than Jung's remained childlike with curiosity and wonderment. And it's also interesting to me too, the notion of 13 hours, 18 hours, let's just say a long time. And the reality is that that's just a stacked stone cairn, 3 or 4 stones piled there, where, let's look at this conversation. And all we know is it took a long time. So when you revisit the conversation as it happened in, A Dangerous Method, it's interesting because you see the depth of both of them there. But you also see Jung playing chess to Freud's checkers. And except that he doesn't judge him, he stays in, and in a way almost doesn't realize he's the teacher, but
Right.
because he's also learning from Freud just by the experience of the interaction. So
Right.
there's a less judgmental quality, I think, that begins right in that conversation from Jung that's more mature and carries the childlike, but Freud carries more the pueris aeternus, the childish, the forever youth of the Peter Pan kind of male.
Yeah. So one of the things that conversation demonstrates is that when you get lost in conversation with someone, even like this conversation today, you actually get lost in your own unconscious. And so there's this one hilarious scene where the two of them are at the head of Freud's table, and they have Freud's entire family gathered around, and these two psychologists are hearing one another, but they're paying no attention to the people that are at the table with them.
At the table, right.
Yeah. Okay, moving on.
Well, the people at the table are like the ocean that they're bobbing around in, and they're talking to each other with their heads above water, so to speak, but they're immersed in the family.
Right. So moving on here, there's a footnote here, which is to Ernest Jones's work, his biography of Freud called Sigmund Freud, Life and Work, which was published in 1953 to 57 in 3 volumes. And Ernest Jones was a famous contemporary of both Freud and Jung. He was present at the 1911 Weimar Conference, the famous photograph of all the big names in psychology for the first half of the 20th century. And they're all there at the Weimar Conference, and Ernest Jones is one of them. So anyway, the biography of Freud shows in a most illuminating way what an extraordinary personality he was. It also reveals the heroic efforts he had to make against his own psychic troubles in order to penetrate into the depths of the psyche. He attempted to bring into consciousness and to formulate the results of the insight which he had gained from working not only on patients, but also on himself. This new psychology burst upon us from all the bookshops of the world, from professional books and journals, from scientific and semi-scientific pocket editions, from novels and poems. It both enlightens and confuses us in the theater and at the cinemas, in more and more new varieties of tests to try to grasp, to pin down the essential nature of man. Yet it is still, in reality, completely overshadowed by the great personalities from whom it emerged and is still emerging. It is curious that the generation of pupils who are now trying to develop a scholarly science from these beginnings should overlook the fact that we are still living in the heroic age of psychology, in which the personalities of the founders, in all their greatness and smallness, must necessarily influence what they can express about the nature of man. This statement doesn't mean that we are joining those people who are, by their opposition to modern psychology, out of touch with their time, nor should we underestimate the large number of psychologists all over the world who have done more or less valid scientific research. Nevertheless, one should bear in mind the extent to which depth psychology is still in its infancy and how tentative its interpretations must inevitably still be. The dogmatic certainty shown by many of its representatives demonstrates the fundamental insecurity of people who have not achieved enough inner stability to be able to afford a skepticism about all human achievement that may well prove fruitful. Such a dogmatic attitude is in direct contrast to that of the founders, In spite of their tenacious and unswerving faith in what appeared to them to be essential, they were continually moving on from one new point of view to another, giving up what had seemed to them established knowledge, and again reviewing and questioning themselves and their work. Okay, Jordan.
Yeah, and I think I should make a caveat clarification that, I cap on Freud all the time for being childish, and in a sense I'm being extremely judgy on him. But to me, what's interesting is he was a genius.
Oh yeah.
But the quote to me applies: if you tell a fish forever that he can't climb a tree, means he's a failure, kind of quote.
Right.
It's that Freud stuck in there, but he stuck in there in the way he did. And then so did Jung. And so I think I kind of need to level that playing field from my perspective in regards to my comments, because again and again reviewing and questioning themselves and their work. The
Right.
only dogmatic attitude was that they both had a force and a focus, and they both moved around in the worlds that they moved around in. I think it's a matter of taste, prefer the Jung because it feels more natural, whereas Jung is trying to be more, let me show you my work. And I'd much prefer the baby than the delivery, except I understand the process of both. So I think in that's such a dogmatic attitude piece. They were continually moving on from one new point of view to another. And that rings true for both Freud and Jung. It's just, I find that Freud stays in the book, but he never gets up and walks outside, I think is the way I would look at it. Whereas Jung is taking the book in his pocket and going to the park, maybe with a Frisbee.
Right. Okay. I wanted to also mention here that there's one thing that I read. Geez, when did I do this? I read it in like 1987 that got me thinking about psychology at all. But I got an audible version of Irving Stone's biography of Freud. And I can highly recommend that because it really puts you into Freud's life and what it was like to be Freud. And, one of the things that was an affliction of his that he dealt with most of his life was that he had cancer in his jaw, I think from too much smoking of cigars or something like that. In those days, a lot of people were doing that. And so he had cancer of the jaw, and he basically had to have a major part of his jaw removed and without what we call anesthesia.
Right.
It was the description of that surgery in Irving Stone's book is quite an eye-opener. And we can all be thankful that we live in the 21st century instead of the beginning of the 20th century, because nowadays you can just check out if you're going to have surgery and
with anesthesia. Then the trauma that the trauma to get you to health was actually more intense and debilitating than being healthy itself with the disease. So I mean, if you watch some films have the rooms, the four people required to hold the person down. And when it gets too intense, the other hired person to cover their mouth from the screaming so the doctor could focus. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that we are all here today, honestly.
Okay. So anyway, let's read on and we'll have some more comments. At this point, it is fitting to recall the magnificent audacity with which Freud, alone and unsupported, undertook a self-analysis and discovered all the contents of the personal unconscious, from the Oedipus complex to infantile sexuality, which have today become common knowledge for Western man. A man of Freud's type, his whole outlook based on his conviction of the supreme value of consciousness, needed the extraordinary courage and uncompromising vision of the explorer, as well as his unremitting tenacity, not only to discover the fact of resistance, his own resistance to the contents of the unconscious, but also to break through to the contents from which this resistance tried to distract him. Yet, just as we realize the unequaled originality of this effort, we come up against the problem of what Jung has called the personal equation of man, which is the specific stamp of the individual with all of his natural one-sidedness. An awareness of his personal equation, however, presupposes an analysis in which a second person of a different temperament and different background confronts as an incorruptible opposite the one-sidedness and the blind spots of the analysis, and so brings him to consciousness and dissolves them. With all due admiration for the creative achievement Freud's self-analysis, one still cannot doubt that even in the case of such a genius, it must fail to yield the same result as the dialogue of a normal analysis. The movement to and fro, which in the form of the phenomenon of the transference provides the central core of every analysis, is lacking in a self-analysis, as Jones himself has pointed out. When, however, this dynamic experience of the thou is essentially other, is lacking, the unconscious data of the personal equation must remain, for the most part, uncorrected, and the loneliness of the unconscious prejudice is not dissolved.
Yeah, and that really brings to light the importance of coming out of a cave. To be a mystic, so to speak, is to go into cave. It's also to deny life and the living. But this is bringing to light that you can have these realizations with yourself. You can, back and forth, internal transference to get through to the pure and the true. And you do learn something about yourself, very much so.
Right.
But there is also then the rubber meets the road. Now you put it out, someone else says something, and it totally could stir you up, trigger you, frustrate you. It could also inspire you, move you, influence you. And so I think that he's coming to us inner self clarity, but there is the too much of the self, like small s self, too much being with oneself. And I think what happens is too much of that becomes toxic, and you're not actually, it's like going in and mixing the dough for the bread all day long. Well, at some point you've got to put the liquid parts in and bake the thing, let it rise and bake it. So I think this brings in the point of, yes, self-reflection is incredibly important. In fact, required. Go ahead, comment on that.
Well, I just wanted to say hi to Art Patterson. Nice to see you here this morning, Art.
So simply put, self-reflection is, go ahead.
Go ahead. Self-reflection.
I was going to say, just simply put, with all those words, self-reflection is key, and it's important, valid, and actually even required, but the interaction with other people as well, because they're doing that too. And I think you learn a more evolved calculus internally by interacting with other people.
Right. And what I wanted to say about this is that what most people don't understand is this is what's going on in a marriage, where your spouse brings in different perspectives, regardless of whether it's a hetero marriage or not. your spouse, your life partner brings in a different perspective, and it's where conflict often arises. And this is where I think we have done a poor job in educating our young people to what it's like to be married, and what the give and take that you need to undergo in order to appreciate your spouse and to learn something from your spouse. It's often difficult, and we often find ourselves quite alone, in fact, but we also have to see that our spouse is coming at something from a different perspective. And in terms of my relationship with my wife, my wife is a judging person and I'm a perceiving person, and that actually saves us, because when my wife judges and says, "Well, you did such and such," I can just say, "Okay, no worries."
Well, what's interesting about that, especially, I mean, that last line, for the most part, uncorrected, and the loneliness of the unconscious prejudice is not dissolved. Right. The other person basically waters that unconscious prejudice. And what's interesting, though, is it puts it to the test. And it's in successful relationships, there's often I will not let you project or transfer onto me, but I will listen intently, powerfully, as you offload and unpackage those things, but not taking it personally. Any given partner is your therapist in a way. And that's right. Then you hear, and then you can say, well, I heard this. Did you hear yourself say this? And you can pick a little gold nugget out of all the alluvium, all the stuff that comes out. And then all of a sudden, they get to give themselves this self-credit because they said that. And they, in a sense, are affecting their self-healing by you not taking their things on, right, but by receiving and letting them get them out. Because like you said, judging versus perception, and that's got to make for some hilarious conversations where you're both angry, but you're not angry at the other person, but you're kind of playing two different chess games at the same time on the same board.
Right. We definitely we definitely do, because my wife is very deeply into Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, and there are a lot of parallels between Tibetan Buddhism and Jungian psychology. So we're largely reconciled with one another, but sometimes we get some pretty funny things going. And anyway, I react like the fawns, hey, that's right. How I react to stuff that's too judgmental. Okay, going on. That Jung was, in this sense, unanalyzed has long been known. I am sorry, Freud. Yeah. There's a Freudian slip.
There's a Freudian slip right there. Okay.
Yeah. That Freud was, in this sense, unanalyzed has long been known. It is, however, surprising and at the same time disturbing that the same applies to all Freud's paladins, who by the solemn, paladin is a knight, so all Freud's supporters, who by the solemn bestowal of a ring were confirmed as members of the innermost circle, and therewith as leaders of the psychoanalytic movement. Apart from those on the periphery of the movement, all these men, except Jones, namely Ferenczi, Abraham Sachs, and Edinger, were Jews. This brings us to a problem, and keeping in mind that Erich Neumann also is a Jew, or was a Jew, and he lived in Tel Aviv for most of his life after 1934. This brings us to a problem that belongs both to Freud and to psychoanalysis, namely the Jewish problem, the significance of which has not yet been given enough attention, and which in this context can only be hinted at. uh, by this, we do not mean the problems arising in this Jewish group from anti-Semitism and deep-seated resentment, for these are relatively comprehensible and were characteristic of unanalyzed Jews of the assimilation period and long after. Often enough, the Jew instinctively feels the goy to be the enemy and the anti-Semite, even when he allows himself to behave anti-Semitically. The Jewish problem of Freud and his paladins is much deeper, and by no means a mere negative bias, but a precondition essentially related to Freud's great work and to psychoanalysis itself. That Freud was indeed conscious of his specifically Jewish qualities is clear from a passage advising Ferenczi how to reply to Mater, who felt that in the conflict between the Viennese Freud and the Zurich Bleuler-Jung schools, the difference between the Jews Vienna and the non-Jews Zurich was significant. Freud wrote, certainly there are great differences between Jewish and Aryan spirit, between the Jewish and Aryan spirit. We can observe that every day. Hence, there would assuredly be here and there differences in outlook on life and art. This statement is, in its simple matter-of-factness, so significant because when expressed by a non-Jew, for example, Jung, it has always been foolishly taken as a proof of anti-Semitism with equal simplicity and as much justification. Freud then, however, goes on to state, but there should not be such a thing as Aryan or Jewish science. Results in science must be identical, though the presentation of them may vary. If these differences mirror themselves in the apprehension of objective relationships in science, there must be something wrong. There's a footnote here from Jones. It may be noted in passing the analysis of the only one analyzed, Jones does not correspond to anything called analysis today. Further references are in volume 2 of Jones. So what he's calling self-analysis here is nothing like psychoanalysis today.
Well, right. And I think the key piece throughout this is especially that resentment piece with it. He says that's not important, but I think what's interesting is the resentment of not coming out of the cave called yourself into the world. And so then Aryan or Jewish become adjectives, but both just simply applying to the human condition. And the fact that I think this really is expressive of Freud's and the Paladins, Freud and his Knights, psychoanalysis of self, which is very, very withholding. If I look at it from a relationship psychology perspective, it's very withholding, because it's as if I am on high, I have all the knowledge. And the reality is that's a very childish King of the Mountain game, because you actually starve your soul by doing that.
Right. And one of the things that we have to address here is that there was a lot going on in the 20th century. We killed 280 million people in wars, among other things. And so Jung at one point was accused of being a Nazi, although he never was. And there is a shadow side of Jung that flowed through from the time of Sabina Spielrein, which is covered in A Dangerous Method, up until, which was 1907 to 1913, particularly, up to the early 30s and even to 1941 when Sabina was murdered by Nazis, there was this current affairs undercurrent that was going on. And so after the Holocaust, the Jews came out of the Holocaust, those that survived, and they were quite resentful, and rightfully so. Any group would be after what happened to them. But that sort of colored the attitude toward Jung's work, because he was a Swiss, he wasn't an American, and so most of the Jews who survived escaped into Britain, as Freud did, or into the United States, and they really controlled psychology in the mid-century, and in many ways, because of the way that the DSM is put together, Freud still rules, because the Jewish perspective on psychoanalysis rules that says that, somebody comes in with X symptom, you can see that symptom and then diagnose them in 10 minutes or something and give them a pill. Well, Jung's perspective was quite different, which was going to real depths. And so there are many Jungian analyses that have gone on for decades, for 10 years or more. And indeed, if you're a Jungian analyst, you're expected to have an analyst of your own. And if you go to a real Jungian conference, everybody that speaks will get up and say, the first thing they'll say is that, I'm James Hillman, let's say, and so is my analyst, because he identifies who his analyst is and that he has an analyst. And Jung thought that was very important. So
I think right there at that point, it's important also to realize even the Freudian Jungian split in regards to how the DSM is utilized. I mean, in America, it is only an insurance coding manual. Right. I mean, it is not a diagnostic tool. And in Europe and the rest of the world, it's one of many diagnostic tools. So to me, there's a superfluous and superficial aspect of the DSM. And also, if we look back to the mentor, tormentor, the parent, the mother, the father, the DSM is inherently flawed because it is only following the committee's allowances of what is included. Specifically, I will pick out the one that I find to be the most glaringly expressive of that. And I think it was homosexuality, I think, was included in the DSM as a disease until the DSM-3. So if you look at modern culture versus the DSM being 30 to 50 years behind modern culture, it's to me glaringly obvious that the DSM becomes a shaming tool rather than a diagnostic tool.
Right.
And so I think that's important.
Right. So we see things like the inventor of the modern computer, whose name escapes me just at the moment, but who was gay, and he was arrested
Turin.
by Turin. What is Turin?
Turin, Turin. Turin.
Yeah.
What's his first name? I don't remember.
Right. Well, Turin was gay. Ended up hanging himself in the end because he was hounded by this attitude that said, well, we have to change him.
Yeah.
And the point is, everybody's different, and we have to learn to live with the differences. And
that's not a new thing. The Greeks, I mean, very much throughout culture and history, that's been a thing. And it's not really until modern times it's become a shame shamed thing. So again, people turning their own shame and resentment out on other people, that's a modern thing too. Whereas if you were on the farm and you were milking the cows and you were riding the 2,000-pound Brahma bull and you were working the fields, the person who owned the farm didn't care. They valued you as the resource that was helping them work this place, this land.
Jamie Perez reminds us it's Alan Turin.
Alan Turin. Yeah, thank you.
Or
Elaine? Alan Turin.
Alan, right. Yeah. And there's a great movie about him called The Imitation Game. I urge you to look at it if you haven't. It's an excellent movie with Keira Knightley, who also starred in A Dangerous Method.
And I think it's important to bring up Alan Turin's machine model, because that's really where he went. It wasn't now the two-dimensional arithmetic of comparison and contrast. There was a three-dimensional calculus that he was after that was really, frankly, anthropomorphic. It was using the human body as a machine model to work with, to fill in the gaps, to add the new pieces. So there was very much, he brought to bear a more robust and living science. And I think that's important to give him credit for, because that was so dynamic.
Right. So the point I wanted to get to here was that during this middle period, there was a lot going on in current events. And Jung certainly did have a shadow. There's no doubt that he had a relationship both with Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff. And he lived in an acknowledged menage a trois for about 40 years. It wasn't a secret. And so he had throughout, he had plenty of shadow. And this is what these confrontations, which include the Jewish Protestant, Vienna, Zurich confrontation, is the topic of The Analyst and the Rabbi, which is the play that I'm performing in June, where I'm playing Jung. It's a very difficult part to play, I should say, because it requires me to bring out into the public Jung's shadow and find a way to deal with that. And this play, which is by Mary Stein and Henry Abramovich, is available. You can see it on YouTube. It's called The Analyst and the Rabbi, and it was published by the Asheville Jung Center on YouTube. And so you can actually see it performed by Swiss actors. But when you see it on a screen, you're seeing it two-dimensionally. And the reason we're performing it in the summer in our confluence is that it's three-dimensional. And with the smell of the grease paint, roar of the crowd, you get a different perspective of it. And it really touches you very deeply when you hear that. And
I think it's important to, pardon the pun, touch on the menage a trois there, because there's polyamory, and then we have monogamy, one person with another. But what's interesting is both have been around since the dawn of time. But there's a piece where, someone cheated on someone. Well, because their relationship agreement was not honest. And if they were truly in a relationship, they would have been honest, and that might have made them not in a relationship. I mean, because of differences. But if I look at, instead of saying monogamy and polyamory, if I look at fidelity and infidelity, and just the word infidel, that was the enemy to one of those groups. So how that has been brought to bear in modern culture is interesting to me, because you get the monogamy as the primary and the infidel, the enemy, polyamory, as the offshoot. And to me, it's still a matter of taste, and that the fact the word infidelity implies a lie, implies cheating. It's an enemy word. The
Right.
infidel was them, the us and them kind of thing. So I think even just the way we use words is important to help to mine the history.
Right. Okay, so I put on the YouTube chat the link to the confluence for June. The seats are filling in, so I do hope that anybody who hopes to join us in Helena, Montana in June, and maybe also check off something in your bucket list, which is a visit to Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah.
Will take a look at that website and join us. And so, we'll be, you'll find it a numinous and luminous experience. Now, reading on, our distance from the conflicts of this creative period during which Freud and Jung came to the parting of the ways enables us to see that what Freud took for granted as scientific was partly colored by his own unconscious prejudices, which had never been analyzed. It almost looks as if he was unaware of this when he wrote to Abraham, quote, "Don't forget that really it is easier for you to follow my thoughts than for Jung, since to begin with, you are completely independent, and then racial relationship brings you closer to my intellectual constitution." One can gather from this sentence that to be a Jew was, in a way, a better racial preparation for a scientific approach to psychology. This statement, like nearly all statements about fundamental racial characteristics, shows an unconscious prejudice. We find this confirmed in the whole of Freud's work, where the chief distinction is seen to lie in the fact that, in contrast to the Jews, non-Jews regard religious contents as of essential significance. It is typical that the word mystical is used to mean of religious content, and one hardly trusts one's eyes when in this context one reads Freud's statement, quote, "We Jews have an easier time having no mystical element," unquote.
And that's so untrue. It's just so untrue. I mean, if I take the Essenic Jews who left, dressed in black a couple millennia ago, they kind of escaped, and there's the Gnostic aspect that's there.
We'll just go on, but
yeah,
this fundamental unconsciousness of Freud, the Jew, about his own historical, if not personal, foundation constitutes a complex typical of this whole group. It shows itself positively as well as negatively in Freud's work because it complex functions in the unconscious as a dynamic factor. Just as Freud forgets that the Jews are the religious people par excellence and have, in the Kabbalah and in Hasidism, produced the most important mystical ideas and movements, so he never took serious accounts of the deeper transpersonal levels of the unconscious that are at work behind the merely personal unconscious. The anti-religious effect is characteristic of a large number of creatively gifted Jews of the 19th century, that is, of the assimilation period. It is an expression of the liberation absolutely necessary, both historically and for the individual, from the yoke of Jewish orthodoxy that took place under the aegis of the Enlightenment and the extremely one-sided development of the natural sciences. The clearest and most naive expression of this view is given by Ferenczi in the following words, quote, "It has seldom been so clear to me as now what a psychological advantage it signifies to be born a Jew and to have been spared in one's childhood all the atavistic nonsense," unquote. You want to comment on that and define atavistic?
I was going to say I need to look up atavistic because I don't want to butcher it.
Okay, well, let me keep reading and you look it up because
because there's a piece there that I want to comment on, but I want to.
This was how the unconscious premises of the Jewish group of analysts came into conflict with a completely different character of the non-Jews whose historical background produced no such anti-religious effect, and for whom, e.g. for Jung and for many others, it was impossible to dismiss the old religious phenomena as merely atavistic nonsense, although this positivistic attitude was widespread and fashionable around the turn of the century. If we now point out some Jewish traits in Freud, which were conditioned by his time and some of his personal complexes, it must be clearly understood that these unconscious characteristics did not prevent a genius like Freud from reaching beyond the purely personal and achieving something of relatively general validity. The universal principle that he discovered, and for which discovery his unconscious Jewish anti-religion effect was partly responsible, was the psychic significance of the father image for Western man, the patriarchate. Okay, go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I didn't want to just jump out with, because I wanted to relook up atavistic, but that's really his quote. Atavistic is ancient, primal, prior, older, primitive is really what it is. And that was a cloaked statement to say that their intellectualism was so much more evolved. They didn't have to go through it. And so it's a $5 word to say you are less than me. And because atavistic would be the primitive, the ancient, the older, that the older means they don't know as much as we do. And again, I love the way Neumann coins that as naive, because it is childish, and it is an us and them, that they're trying to be insular, and there's a fear, actually a terrified child in that's trying to be only intellectual and only scientific.
So let me reread that sentence then. The clearest and most naive expression of this view is given by Ferenczi in the following words, quote, "It has seldom been so clear to me as now what a psychological advantage it signifies to be born a Jew and to have been spared in one's childhood all the atavistic nonsense."
What's interestingly hidden, I think, in that too, if I look at Moses and the path of a whole culture being cast out, they were on the passage. So in one sense, this is not naive, because there is an experiential quality to the Jewish culture that has wandered, that has gone through passage, not just stayed in place. But in this quote, of course, that's denying that passage of, we don't have to go through the process, all that atavistic nonsense. We can just figure it out. It's all head, not heart. So this, I have to say, that clearest and most naive expression, yes. And then I also have to comment that I have to compliment it. Out of the mouths of babes, the naiveness of this implying the passage. So it's both and at the same time, it comes across as disparaging. So then I have to land on that, because the intent seems to be to disparage.
Right. So we're lucky that Indian Englishman, Indian, a man of Indian descent who was British, named Sono Shamdasani,
Right.
who wasn't had no dog in the British or in the Jewish Christian fight, finally brought out the Red Book. And when he brought out the Red Book, that seems to be the breakout moment where all of a sudden Jung's writing, which he knew what he had done 48 years before it came out, and it's now over 60 years since Jung died, his writing is now coming into its own because we had a person who didn't have any deep unconscious prejudice toward the Jewish view or the Christian view, who pointed out that, hey, there's stuff here that we need to know about. And
he lived swimming in between both, with
right.
both, in that whole mecca of that area of the world that used to be, the confluence, for
Right.
lack of a better word.
Right.
Where, I mean,
he opened an access to a new stream, which is a pretty damn big stream at this point. It's become like the Nile or the Mississippi or the Amazon. And so thank you, Freud, for starting us off, but now we see where things really are. Okay, so I'm going to continue to read this. It has long been evident that for Freud, the father complex played a decisive role, yet it would be wrong to understand this complex merely as a matter of individual and family history. Close behind it, without Freud's ever being conscious of this, stands the confrontation with the Jewish father god, that is, psychologically, with the father archetype. Two characteristic incidents from Freud's life that Jones mentions in his biography should be cited. And they're from volume 1, pages 317 to 348 and 146 to 165 and following. And I think he's referring to two different publications. One is in American English and one is in Britain, I believe, they shed on the problem of how closely the contents of the personal unconscious, the relationship of child to father, brother, etc., are connected with the attitude toward transpersonal contents. On both occasions, when Freud suddenly fainted, it happened in connection with his pupil and friend Jung, who later parted from him. The first time Freud fainted was after he had succeeded in converting Jung from his anti-alcoholism. Freud himself interpreted this as a failure in the face of success. He paid for his victory over Jung with his fainting, but this happened because Freud, according to his own interpretation, identified Jung with his younger brother, for whose death he had as a child wished out of jealousy, like every older sibling. When, however, this brother actually died in childhood, this naturally led to anxiety and feelings of guilt on the part of the elder brother about his victory. The second occasion of Jung's fainting is no less significant. Freud's, there's that Freudian slip again. It's Freud's, the second occasion of Freud's fainting is no less significant and is closely connected with the first. A conversation took place in which Jung, wrongly, we think, denied Freud's thesis of the general occurrence of death wishes toward parents. There followed a discussion about the great Egyptian king Ignatian.
And I would actually comment that there's some autocorrect stuff that's occurring here. That would be Akhenaten, Akhenaten, Akhenaten.
Akhenaten. Freud remarked that this was the king who erased his father's name from all monuments, and Jung replied that Freud had overemphasized this relation to the father and that the most important act of this king had been the establishment of monotheism, whereupon Freud fainted. The real issue here is deeper than the mere personal problem of Freud's identification with the annihilation of the father and Jung's with the annihilating son, although this constellation also has its validity. Beyond this, however, the philosophical and psychic differences between the two men become apparent, whereas Freud only acknowledges the personal father and is aware of nothing transpersonal, nothing beyond this affect relationship. Jung stresses the significance of the transpersonal father image that exists independently of the personal relation to the father. And so we would give examples of that to, a king of England, if there were a king, or any king of Saudi Arabia, and the president of the United States. Those are beyond the family. And
exactly. And then also beyond then time, go back to the biblical piece to include the son. So Abraham called to, right, sacrifice his son. That, if you put it in context with the, wonderfully dirty language of Hebraic, I mean, that's been whitewashed out, unfortunately. Those things wouldn't have such a prominence if in the original language. But what's interesting there is they do stand out. And what's interesting also is it's not the murder of the son, it's the child becoming the parent of the man. So it's basically, there's a rite of passage metaphor there, that you're not actually killing someone. You're moving on into adulthood as the man, no longer the child. So there's an implied metaphor rather than an actual murder there. Right. So to include both father and son, I think, right, contrasts,
Okay, so reading on, for Freud, the killing of the father is not only a childhood incident of the Oedipus complex. It is well known that in his ethnologically untenable work, Totem and Taboo, he made the allegedly primeval killing of the father into the origin of religion, and supposed the father god to be nothing but a glorification of the murdered tribal father. Right. It is symptomatic that Freud wrote this work at the time of his emotional reaction over Freud's withdrawal, or over Jung's withdrawal. Yeah, there it goes again.
This is great. It's as good as the bad punctuation and spelling in this copy.
You're right. So it is symptomatic that Freud wrote this work at the time of his emotional reaction over Jung's withdrawal, and emphasized on May 8th, 1913, I am working on the last section of the totem, which comes to the right moment to deepen the gap between him and Jung by fathoms. He thought the essay would serve to make a sharp division between us and all Aryan religiosity, but that will be the result of it. In the dispute with Zurich, it comes at the right time to divide us as an acid does a salt.
I think it's important to pause here to show that these people in power, and I will in no way ever support the Holocaust at all, whatsoever. Right. And I want to make that clear. But this sharp division was a sharp division. And right. This is two sides prefiguring the battle to come. Right. And the thing is, there was such, and we're seeing that in today's culture, such an insulation, such a separation between the Judaic and the Aryan, that it could only come to, a crash like acid does a salt. So right. A salt is a corrosive, which is interesting here, right. But an acid is a bigger corrosive. Right. And so the fact that they are playing this religious cultural divide out, just even in their letters, shows how prejudiced they were, which we see happening in our culture now. So I would say that, if we relieve ourselves of this, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because this tells us a lot about what's going on
and about
in
us,
about
right
us.
now.
And not that
it's
I'm right
coming
and
up,
you're
right.
not that I'm right and you're wrong, because what's happening here is that I'm right, and then the other person says, no, I'm righter, and
Right.
I'm more right, and then I'm more, and then it becomes this in a sense divine passage. Then people
Right.
invoke the divinity because they're so pure, but the problem is that purity is actually unhealthy.
Right.
So I think that I wanted to bring
right.
that up, because we really see, and this is just that last statement, would serve to make a sharp division between us and all Aryan religiosity. Well, who's the victim and who's the tormentor? That they're both gunning for the controller piece here, and
right.
and we see what happened.
This is a central issue that's raised in our play, The Analyst and the Rabbi, which you can find on YouTube, but which I've committed untold hours memorizing the Jung part in, and it's very difficult to play this part because it exposes much of Jung's shadow, which is also my shadow in a way. And it also exposes the problem that we have in current affairs today. And the final point of the play is that we all live in a gray zone. We all live in the gray zone. It's not perfectly this or that, and we have to learn to find some middle ground that we can work with. Vis-a-vis all cultural groups, not only between Jews and Jews and Aryans, but between Americans and Chinese, for example.
I appreciate that you're taking on the difficulty of the complete Jung character, because I think what's interesting is, as troublesome, as difficult, and probably as powerfully beautiful as it is, we will get an opportunity to experience him in person as a person, rather than the on high, only reading for the footnotes, only reading for the presence, but that which put this work forward. And I think that's important, especially in this case. I mean, I often separate the author from their work, because there are plenty of people in history that have done wonderful architectural work. For example, R.A. Schwaller de Randy Lubitsch, he was an outright fascist, but his work at the Temple of Luxor at Karnak was amazing. So with him, I'd rather amputate the person and go with the beautiful quality of the work. But with Jung, I feel like they do go hand in hand, because part of it was his honesty with himself, and he was analyzed also, and he was open to the process. So I appreciate that you're taking this on, and I can appreciate the difficulty also, that it's probably emotional.
It is quite emotional, I can assure you. And in surprising ways, I found that when we did our first reading of the play, I simply broke down and wept at a number of spots in this play. And even though I had studied it for 4 months already, by the time we did that reading together, I didn't know it was going to affect me that way. But when we did it live, not reading it, not as I was doing or listening to it as I was doing, but actually doing it live with another person, oh my God, we'll see how I do. We'll see how we do on the stage, but oh my God, it's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to try to push through two more tranches, and we'll get to the.
You want me to read for a little while, or?
No, I'll go ahead.
Okay.
It is doubtful whether this clearly expressed effect can ever form the basis of a science. And one remembers Freud's own words, quote, if these differences mirror themselves in the apprehension of objective relationships in science, there must be something wrong, unquote. Freud was in a mood of elation while he was writing this work, but later he was assailed by doubts. Frenzy and Jones interpreted these as follows, quote, his elation represented the excitement of killing and eating the father, and his doubts were only the reaction, unquote. This interpretation was accepted by Freud and elaborated in the statement, quote, then, in the interpretation of dreams, I described the wish to kill one's father, and now I have been describing the actual killing. After all, it is a big step from a wish to a deed. It is noteworthy that Freud talks of the deed as if he had committed and not described it. And that's
inflation.
That's what we're talking about here in the play also. We're actually performing it as opposed to describing it.
Right.
But Freud's magnificent battle with the unconscious Jewish problem of the father and the father God goes on. Simultaneously with his On History of the Psychoanalytic Movement, in which he rid himself of his anger over the desertion of his pupils, he writes the essay on the Moses of Michelangelo. In it, he interprets the figure of Moses as an expression of the great effort Moses had to make to control his anger when he saw God and himself deserted by the people. It has not escaped the attention of his pupils that Freud was, on the other hand, identified with the father figure, namely Moses, as was already clear from the Akhenaten incident, and on the other hand, opposed the father as son. This tragic unconscious dichotomy forced Freud to publish the study on the Moses of Michelangelo anonymously, and to justify this by saying, why disgrace Moses by putting my name to it? It also caused him, in his last book, to make Moses an Egyptian. In a similar way, the figure of the Jewish Christian father God, killed in Totem and Taboo and in the Future of an Illusion, is resurrected in the human psyche as the superego and continues to play there the same violent and repressive part of the moral lawgiver against whom the rebellious patricide of the liberating Jewish sons had originally and rightly been directed. Okay, I'll stop there. Go ahead.
Well, actually, I just want to correct myself, to be honest. The Akhenaten is a misspelling of an actual different version of the name. So okay. It is Akhenaten, but it's usually ICH in the different. So it basically just would tell us what language this autocorrect comes from, right. Which is really ancillary here. So this is interesting to me, this whole part of the father and the son, where with Freud killing the father, I'd jump further that he felt like the son to Jung the father. And even though he was older, Jung, the quote unquote protege, was actually the mentor in the situation. And I think that naivete of, we didn't go through these atavistic, these primitive things, shows clearly the inflation of a child that has not yet seen war, so to speak. And in this case, wouldn't be war, it would be life itself, marriage, relationship, sex, death, resurrection, all of that Jung has experienced these things. And I wonder if with Jung's background, parents, 6 generations of, the ministry, he's been to funerals, he's experienced death. And I think what's interesting there is it comes out of the ecclesiastical institution. It's not a clean thing. It's not that he's sanitized, It's that he's played in the dirt.
Right.
And
and he
Freud has
grew,
tried to
he,
stay so clean, and that's a real dishonesty to
yeah,
self and culture, because life is dirty. I
right.
mean,
And
not
Jung
like,
grew up in a rural community where he was quite up close and personal with the realities of life in a farm.
yeah,
And
even
so,
dinner involved murder. I mean, or killing, or the hunting on, hunting in the corral. Go get a chicken, please. And
right.
then it's not just get a chicken because you went to the store and got it for this much per pound. Okay, now wring the neck. Now pluck the feathers. This is a half a day event to have chicken dinner.
Right.
It's like just to get the prep done. Just
Yeah,
so
we've
you
got
kind
all
of
that
can't miss that.
sublimated now. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
we that you kind of can't miss that if you grow up on the farm. I mean,
you don't
it's
you don't have to think about slaughtering the cow when you go to the grocery store and are looking at hamburger in the
yeah.
meat.
I remember a friend of mine saying, "Mom, it'll take me the same amount of time for you turn on the oven and preheat it. The same amount of time for the oven to preheat for me to drive into town, buy a chicken, and come back. And as it is going to take me to run out there and hurriedly kill the chicken and pull defeather it, and et cetera, et cetera." And I laughed. I'm like, wow, you must be really good at that thing, because if you can get into town and back at the same time you can dress a chicken. And here's the thing, there's the sublimated statement.
Yeah.
Oh, could you dress the chicken, please? Well, that means go kill it, go catch it, kill it, take the feathers out, clean it. I mean, dress, just one word. So I laugh that even in the military, then dress blues or dress greens. Well, look at that. I mean, versus that's a prepared individual in dress uniform, and that's that chicken who's been taken down to the pure, in a sense. And there's no chicken about that chicken.
Yeah, right. Okay, so there's a terrific punchline to this essay. So I'm going to read through to the end,
Okay.
and then you can comment on the punchline. Freud's heroic struggle with the father archetype of Judaism within him is one that plays an essential part in the changes taking place in modern Judaism. Judaism has broken its old religious fetters without having as yet arrived at a new orientation. This battle is not Freud's personal affair only, nor is it simply a problem of Jewry itself. Western culture, religion, society, and morals is mainly formed by this father image, and the psychic structure of the individual is partly damaged by it. It is for this reason that Freud's findings, his deductions and documentations connected with the Oedipus complex and patricide, are of the greatest importance and relatively true as applied to people living in the patriarchal world. Patriarchal culture means the culture of consciousness and the rule of reason. Today, as always, the battle of Western consciousness is fought in the spirit of the Old Testament war against the mother goddess. It is fascinating to observe how Freud, hesitantly, reluctantly, and forced by his own integrity, leaves the territory of the Holy Father God, who sanctifies consciousness and moves toward confrontation with the other side, the unconscious. Yet, although he went so far as to realize the necessity of patricide, and at the end of his life abandoned the monistic and monotheistic attitude that he had originally maintained against Jung, the Jewish taboo of the mother goddess, that is, of the unconscious, prevailed with him in the end. Just as the medieval Jew, characteristically and strangely enough also the Kabbalah, connected the masculine with grace and the feminine with judgment and evil, compared the merciful figure of the Madonna in Christianity, so Freud sees the unconscious as an id, generally hostile to culture and to consciousness, and always an overpowering negative. Freud's inherent honesty made him admit that in the picture of human history, which he wrongly drew in totem and taboo, the figure of the mother goddess who preceded the father god had been lacking. He never discovered the decisive significance of the mother in the destiny of the individual and of mankind. His psychology of the feminine is therefore a patriarchal misconception, and his lack of understanding of the nature of religion and of artistic creation comes from the same unawareness of the creative psyche, which mythologically is connected with the mother goddess and the pre-patriarchal level of the unconscious. As a great Jew at the turning point not only of the patriarchal era, but also of the cultural history of the Jews, Freud opened the way for the liberation of man from the oppression of the old father figure to which he himself remained deeply fixated. Like his great forebear Moses, he led the way out of servitude, but the land of promise, in which the earth mother has a place beside the celestial father, he saw only from afar.
Yeah, and that puts it in perspective where Freud's father is actually still the son, because it is lacking the mother, which is the larger, the Gaia, the earth force, the living organism of earth, the mother goddess.
Right.
And it's interesting there because he only saw from afar. So in a sense, Freud being so patriarchal, that explains it right there, where his father figure was actually son, and the mother was the larger, but the larger he couldn't fathom. He'd only see it from, as he said, afar.
Right. And so Zen Mode HQ says that the two pillars of Kabbalah's tree of life, severity versus mercy, and masculine versus feminine, very much so. And we're going to have a presentation on the Kabbalah this summer. Jung understood this better than just about anyone. Yes, assuredly he did. And he was seeing this turn. He and Freud represent, one guy who was still stuck in the patriarchal, and another guy who was seeing that, there's going to be another way of looking at this, and that we all live in the gray zone, that, not everything is patriarchal.
Well, and also the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy, both each contain the other, because aren't on the masculine side the Sephiroth all feminine, and on the feminine side aren't the Sephiroth all masculine? I mean, or is there a combination? Because don't they hand off to one another, so that
Surely they do.
What is
Right.
big on one is the other and small in it, and what's
Right.
big on the other is the small and the other within it. So
Right.
neither either has difference, except they are unique. And it's interesting that if the anima inside the masculine, and the animus inside the feminine, that spirit which resides within becomes the key driver of how that pillar functions.
Right. And that's the brilliant thing about the Kabbalah, which does bring a mystical experience, because once you grok it, then it's numinous and it's luminous, and it makes us appreciate the world a lot better.
I think so. And I think what's interesting about the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, a lot of people look at it and they go, oh, I'm going to look at the 10 spheres or the 10 Sephiroth and look at that. And I'm going to learn that's on the ground, dealing with them and the paths. If you also look in context of where they each are and how they interrelate to their neighbors, who they reach out to, look at then the bigger picture of which pillar are they on or near, traveling to or from, kind of Janus goddess of both and, going through the door and coming out the door. it's interesting to me how dynamic that diagram actually is. Not even adding the four worlds with four of them, just with one, not 40. It it's a very big deceptive simplicity that goes
Yeah.
on in that diagram that
Right.
really says quite a lot.
Right. So just in case, says often Freud himself stated that he didn't understand women, yet several women had important roles in his private life. And yes, of course, that's true. And everybody can go read up on all those fun details separate
Right.
from this discussion.
But again, that separates the Freud and Jung. You know, which one is the child and which one is the man? Which one is the child? Which one is the woman? Not either of them, but I just want to include both masculine and feminine here. That because all the women listeners too. I mean, there's the child becoming the parent of the woman in this thing as well.
So we've been reading from volume 2 of the 3-volume set by Erich Neumann. This particular volume 2, is called Creative Man. Just for your general information, folks, we are probably starting in February. We're going to be going through all 3 volumes in our advanced reading group. So if you'd like to join our advanced reading group, please go to our MailChimp and register for that.
I'm happy that the Christmas gift came with a little bit of Miracle Grow. I'm digging, because these are some of my favorite works, and that you took to them like a duck does to water. This is really cool.
Well, I knew I should have, and thank you to Jordan for giving me volume 3 of this, because I would not have necessarily known about this series of Neumann without his intervention at Christmas time, giving me this book.
It's amazing how hidden this is, and to me, it's amazing how important something like this is hidden. I mean, it's not that it's unknown, but it's not on the top echelon of the recommendations.
It's not taught in university, and that has been one of my purposes here, which has always been on YouTube, to offer a graduate level course in Jungian psychology to the general public, so that people start to get what this is really about. And it's definitely taken off. Even before me, there was Louis LaFontaine, who was running the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Facebook page. And Louis has diligently, over decades, put out quotes of Jung's work for us to try to understand. And I'm putting the MailChimp URL up, so that in case you're interested in, whoops, there's an error there for some reason. Let me try it again. Okay, there it is. Okay, so that's the URL to register for the advanced reading group, where we'll be discussing these things in great detail. And but anyway, Louis, when I joined his page, he already had 4,000 followers. That was in 2005, but he now has something like 85,000 followers.
Right.
So Jungian psychology has literally taken off in the last couple of decades, especially after the advent of the Red Book. And of course, I joined his page 4 years before the Red Book was published. And after it was published, it really got cooking. And a lot of people are understanding that we live life in the eros. And the simple metaphor I've given is that everything in your room, other than human beings and potted plants, is the logos, and it's dead. We don't live, but we don't live in that. We live in the eros. So a Bible is just a black doorstop unless you have a gifted pastor who brings life to it. And
I think that's important too. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up yet again, because then the lamp in front of me, the framed painting, liquid this, candle that. I mean, all those things are differentiated logos, differentiated vessel that the eros of my life is poured into, that I've poured. Our homes to me are the eros of our psyche turned inside out. Mm-hmm. Our collections are actually, and you're right, they're dead, they're inert, but they're memories. Like a snake sheds its skin, the snake doesn't miss its skin. Right. And they're memories that are milestones, certain candles that will never, ever be lit again. But they will always remain where they are because that's their home. So I love that all these things out here are dead. Well, they're my ancestors, the ancestors of my life, right, that I've chosen. So I think that's a great vessel and heart of the matter poured into the vessel piece just for dwelling. And Jung, right, I think, helps us to dwell.
Well, and I think there's a very interesting concept here, which is that Jung equated God with the unconscious and the collective unconscious. And then I heard recently, and this is very true, that everything around us is a manifestation of the collective unconscious. So that if you look around wherever you live, that's a manifestation of the collective unconscious, because it's something that all of us and all of our ancestors build up to, and there it is. It's laid before right, you on the earth. And so now we have something to pour our lives and our psyches into. And yes, that's what it is. So just remember, everyone, we live our lives on the eros side, not on the logos side. And unlike Jordan Peterson, with whom I take exception, not everything has to be a hierarchy.
It's funny. I wondered if this was going to happen. There are plenty of Jungians and Taos,
I'm sure.
And I'm out on the plaza and someone's talking to me. I'm talking to them. Their friend comes up. They don't introduce me as Jordan Hoggard. They introduce me as Jordan. The guy lights into me as if I'm Jordan Peterson, telling me how wrong and how superficial and blah, blah, blah. And I said, my last name's not Peterson. I'm a Jungian, but not that one.
Well, so Jordan Peterson is surely not a Jungian.
But I started to raise my hand, and the friend who had introduced me backed up behind him and was like, and it was completely Sun Tzu, Art of War, don't interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake, because this was a friend who wanted to see him go off hard on Jordan Peterson, but he had been trying to get him to go off on Jordan Peterson, but he thought that would be rude. But when he met the person, it wasn't Jordan Peterson, but had the first name. It was a rampage. I was actually impressed with the polysyllabic clarity that had zero punctuation. I mean, it was just someone opened the Hoover Dam and here it comes. Just those commas funny. And periods can disappear. And then when I finally went like this, I literally 5 minutes, and I'm like, he's got to need to breathe. I mean, I don't want him to suffocate because I want this to continue. But I laughed that I got mistaken because just someone said Jordan. And I have to say, it was one. I wish I had it recorded because it was one of the most hilarious. I was like, wow, if I could be so disrespected as to be lambasted by someone, wow, I made the right enemy.
Well, and as I was reading this essay, I was actually connecting with how much Jordan Peterson is actually a Freudian and not a Jungian.
Yes. and not a Jungian. Yeah. And that's,
and because he's entirely dependent, his psychological attitude is entirely dependent on the patriarchy. And he doesn't realize that we all live in the gray zone. We all live between patriarchy and matriarchy.
and he's also all shored up on his following, where what is he anymore kind of has gone missing. I mean, I look at, he's got message, but he's surfing the top of the ocean of followers instead of dialing into the internal ocean of him.
Well,
He
think
feels separated.
Yeah, I think he's sensitive now since his illness, and he's being very tentative. And I've had any number of people over the years suggest that I should have an interview with Jordan Peterson, and I've actually invited him to such a conversation. But I said, but not until you're ready. And I think that he made his bones. He got his books out and became a best-selling author, and he made enough money on it so that probably doesn't have to work for the rest of his life. And so now he's being rather tentative in terms of coming out into the public square. And I think that's appropriate for someone who's recovering from such a major trauma. And he had really major trauma in the last 5 years, including the almost death of his wife and then his almost death. And so
and I have to say, I respect it. Once I came to the same piece, when I realized he's more of the son to the father, Freudian Jungian, rather than Jungian, that opened me to a respect point for him, that regardless of how superficial I think he is, and it's not my place to tell him what he should do with his life. That would be self-righteous, high horse, hoopy, and the reality is, when I realized he single-handedly has caused so many million people to discover Carl Jung, to their own merit, to their own value, to their own perspectives, that then I have to just get tingles up and down and go, wow, I can't come at him anymore.
Well, that's very true. I mean, what I would say is that thank you, Jordan Peterson, for all your Jung name dropping. Okay, he likes to quote, use Jung quotes all the time, and for that reason, a lot of people think he's Jungian. But
he's kind of an inspirational speaker, a coach, and Tony Robbins. And I don't want to, discount him either, because he's got a power that just
definitely
it moves people, and it's wise. And I think that's important, is that he found his place, and to me, honestly, that when I finally realized, wow, what am I projecting? What kind of jealousy, anxiety he's doing his thing, I'm doing my thing. Well, his thing made millions and millions of dollars. Well, that's not my purpose. And, and so I just have to, I respect what he's done. And it's interesting that descent within the ranks, so to speak, we're on the same side.
Yes, that's right. We're all about growing up, right?
Yeah. So don't need a mutiny.
Right.
And betrayal.
So, if I were ever to talk with Jordan Peterson, it would be a convivial discussion. And it would not be a debate per se.
Right. It's no chess match, no challenge. It's like, oh, cool. Let's have that 13 hours,
right.
Sit down
and so anyway. Okay, well, thanks, Jordan, for joining me this morning. And I have no idea what to talk about next week, but I'm sure we'll think of something.
Yeah, well, we've got 3 volumes to play around with, and then lots of others that we haven't looked at. So
right. So I have found a couple of other things recently, but
Cool.
Anyway,
Well, I'd say have a good week, but I'll see you tomorrow evening and Wednesday afternoon. So.
Yeah. And Jamie Perez, who's a friend of mine, says, I wouldn't have discovered Jung were it not for Peterson.
Mhm.
And Steve Jones says the movie The Imitation Game was excellent. Yes, both. And Keira Knightley should have won an Academy Award for both of them, but
Yeah.
She keeps appearing in movies about people who are controversial. And so the Academy Awards is afraid to give her an Academy Award, but she certainly deserves it very often because her acting is outstanding.
It is. And I have to say, it's interesting to me how she kind of outs the politics of substance. If there's something that's really there to chew on, they're going to steer around it like a rock in a river, and it's just the nature of the beast. But I laugh that they're going to be politics that, no, we can't have that much substance. This needs to be entertaining.
Right. So just in case says, Peterson did recently give an interview on YouTube with Michael Shermer, a huge skeptic. That's the sort of interview I prefer. Skeptics ask the hard questions that we should also ask ourselves. So, yes. And so Jordan Peterson made a lot of people think, and he certainly helped direct some of my thinking, particularly in the early going. I like a story about Pinocchio. That's a good one. I'm less enthusiastic about his hierarchical structure, but in any case, that's just me because I'm a P, not a J, so I don't judge.
Well, I laugh that I'm a J, and and it's interesting, but I'm also an F. So when you say that, I like his Pinocchio, but I don't like the hierarchy, and I'm like, amen, brother, because I'm like, wow, that right there, the hierarchy to me is what really puts the nail in the coffin on he's a Freudian Jungian, having to have that, I left no more splaining to do, Lucy. It's like, just, you got to have the action.
Well, I mean, he's a practicing psychotherapist, and so
right.
he has to make his business based on the DSM, which is unfortunate because the DSM is all about logic and rationality, and we don't live our lives in that part of the world. So.
Well, and it's interesting. A comedian years back who was spoofing on the DSM, he's like, "Oh my God, I watch a commercial these days, and there's this frisbee and this kite in a sunny day in the park, and this disease comes with a hot chick and a puppy. What is it? And it's like herpessin or something for herpes, and it's, how do I get that? But then he goes on and he goes, so do you wake up tired in the morning? Oh my God, write this down. I have this. So I laugh that, you can spoof it at the same time you can celebrate it, and it doesn't really change it much.
Yeah. So I guess the point is, wake up and smell the roses. Yesterday, I mean, we've been confined for the best part of 2 years because my mother-in-law is 91 years old, and we're no spring chickens here, so we don't want to catch COVID, and so we've been quite fastidious in our bubble. But yesterday we just had to go out and air ourselves back out in life, so we just drove down to this little beach community, went into an ice cream stand and ordered big dishes of ice cream.
Nice.
That's where life is. It's not staring at these four walls or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, I remember an interview years back.
I'm ripping out my headset, so it must be time to stop, I guess.
Yeah, we're getting there. I just real quickly, in an interview years ago, a friend of mine, I had asked her to get a copy of the DSM, just go borrow one. And she said, this is really depressing. And I said, what do you expect from a book that is all about disorders? Did you expect like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny to come popping out somewhere? It's like, so the fact that it was such a buzz killer just to go through, that to me said how one-sided it is. And that's the science, that's the diagnostic. You have to have specificity. But at the same time, that's arithmetic and it's not calculus.
Right. And Zen says, Skip's differing with Jordan on the hierarchical structure is well noted, but you have a lot of other things to agree upon as well. And I agree with that entirely. As I've often said, I agree with Jordan Peterson about 99.5% of the time. And it's only when he starts getting very rigid in his perception and in his presentation, and especially about the hierarchy, that I think, that might use some adjustment. But
when I'm watching him, I often will call out, oh, here comes the foam on the waves, all that. But then it just disappears and goes back to the ocean. So when he does get that specificity, it is a little bit perturbing.
Yeah. Justin says, and this is something I hadn't heard of, Keira Knightley was excellent in Never Let Me Go, based on Kazuo Ishiguro's 2005 novel. Allow me to recommend it if you don't know it already. Both the movie and the novel are unforgettable. Never Let Me Go. Okay.
I'll have to look at that. Thank you.
That's one I didn't know about.
Thank you, Justin.
So I appreciate that very much.
Actually, was she in Pitch Black? And it's just a different Keira.
What's that?
Let me check. Keira Knightley. There's a movie called Pitch Black. It was written for Vin Diesel, but just from his. I'll check. I'll mention it next week if I find her in it.
Right now, Tara Podol says Bitcoin, it's leveling up for humanity in every tertiary stream. Arguably. I mean, it's another currency, and we have many currencies, right? Great art is a currency, and many other things are currency besides Bitcoins or dollar bills. And you have to decide what's of value to you, I guess. And
though it's not tied to the market this week, it paralleled just everything the market was doing. So
yesterday,
there's a whole, if you can't beat them, join them. That's it used to be,
Yesterday, I heard that, what is it? The second vaccine company, not Pfizer, but
Moderna.
Moderna's stock has really cratered apparently in the past week because somebody whispered out in the market that it's not 100% foolproof, which they've been saying for a year and a half, but finally the penny dropped, and all of a sudden, boom, the stock dropped. So,
the right, wrong ears heard it, and I mean, I laugh. I was in the supermarket Thursday, and several people up, I was, just in my own head thinking whatever. All of a sudden, you just hear them start going off about the market. And they're like, "Oh, buy low, sell high," and I started laughing. And he's like, "What's so funny?" I said, "Buy low, buy high, daily cost value valuation, don't sell." He's like, "Well, how are you going to make any money?" I'm like, "If you want to make money, there's an ATM right over there on the wall. You can get some right there." Yeah. But on the market, it's like, no, you stay in the boat. You don't hop off the boat in the middle of a stormy ocean.
Well, maybe you
So
do, depending.
some
But
do.
yeah, but anyway, Justin says, I think it was Rihanna Griffith in Pitch Black who looks a bit like Kira. And then
Yeah, I think you're
Zen
right.
Mode said in POW camps, even cigarettes were currency. And I would say that even rats were, because you have to read the novel King Rat to appreciate what I'm talking about by James Clavell. It was his first novel, and it was about how men survived in Changi, which was the prison camp that British soldiers were put in Singapore during World War II. And they had to survive in there for about 2.5 or 3 years. And in that environment, what it was and still is the location of a prison. It's also the location of the Singapore International Airport.
Yeah.
but anyway, at that time, when the Japanese took over, the Japanese soldiers moved into the prison, and they let the prisoners be out in just in the wild, because there was no escape from Singapore.
Right.
You couldn't swim away from it, and in those days there was plenty of stuff that could kill you out there if you didn't have proper equipment and that sort of stuff. And so, there was no swimming off of Singapore over to Johor to get to safety. That wasn't a thing.
Yeah, it's like the pre-Mad Max.
Right. And it still isn't a thing. And but anyway, in that book, King Rat, which is a very big favorite of mine, it basically teaches economics 101, microeconomics 101. And this corporal in the British Army creates a market for rats, which tastes like chicken. And he sells it. He sells it as chicken, and so he becomes like the king of this hierarchy. But when the war is over, he's been living in this bubble of a environment for this 3-year period, and when the war is over, the market for rats goes way down.
Right.
And he's back to being a corporal, not the king, not the king. I mean, at one point in the novel, I forget if it's a colonel or a general is sort of begging him to do something, and a Zippo lighter becomes worth $10,000 and so on. But
there was a movie I saw recently. I'm surprised I can't remember the name, but The Rock was in it, and it was about finding the pink flower of something, but down in the Amazon and all this. But there was a point. It's funny, on the topic of rats, he catches a rat because everyone's really hungry, and they say, well, we're going to eat that. Oh, no. And he drops it off the boat and grabs his net. What he does is he basically drops it in the water, and here come all the piranhas. Well, you can't catch a piranha with a line because it's just going to chew it's going to snap the line. Mm-hmm. But so he just drops the rat in, nets some piranhas, and then he's going to barbecue piranhas. But so it's, the rat currency becomes bait, at some point.
And Wendigo says the main one who loses out in a cigarette as currency system is the guy with the nicotine addiction.
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah, he'll devalue his currency.
Yeah. At one point, my father-in-law, Debbie's father, was a sailor on a merchant ship during World War II for 2 years. He was, in convoys and so on, but he was the gunner. They put 5-inch guns on merchant ships during World War II. But he was on this merchant ship for 2 years, and at one point he owned, because he was an excellent card and dice player, he owned every cigarette on the ship.
It's in that comment too. I mean, what happened to your currency? I ate it. It's like the rat, or you smoked it, the cigarette. I mean, but that's the person who has the addiction to the currency. That's the man with a Midas touch starves his soul. No, it's because he ate all his money. He doesn't have any anymore.
Right. Okay, so peace, everyone.
All right, have a good one.
Wrap it up.